Hello, welcome to the second video of Over the Unraveling. In our last video, we talked about the Vietnam War, how things starting in 1969 but progressing into the 1970s, things started boiling over in American society. People started questioning the government, their government's motives, and seeing that things in America aren't all going great, that things need to change. So in this video, we're going to continue that with talking about the social changes that are taking place in America during the late 1960s into the early 1970s. Um, so uh, Also in our last video, we talked about Nixon getting elected to the presidency and how things start to change. We'll talk about him a little bit more in the second and third videos of this Unraveling series that we'll call it. So in this video, we're going to mainly deal with civil rights, a continuation of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and how things went from progressively more peaceful over to boiling over with all these tensions that things perhaps aren't changing enough. That we need to do more in America to truly ensure equality. So we had uh, now talking about the civil rights movement, we had the more popular movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. That promoted sit-ins, peaceful marches, and turning the other cheek as a main strategy of this civil rights movement. And it ended up with the Civil Rights Act of 1968, along with the Voting Rights Act. Uh, Also, we talked about another group that was rising at this time, which was the Black Power movement, and one of its leaders, Malcolm X, um, promoted that African Americans should have equality, and if necessary, that they should fight for it. Um, so, so both of these things start to add to this growing civil rights movement. So now going into the 1970s, after the Civil Rights Act, we see a growing desegregation of America, but there were still many societal problems such as race and inequality and economic inequality. And for the most part, some of those issues still exist in America today, which we'll continue to talk about. To get a better picture of this, let's see how some African Americans were represented in popular sitcoms in the 1970s. We think of sitcoms as just some sort of like silly content, but in reality, sitcoms use relatable things that they prey on. They don't prey on. Let's say they show relatable things that happen in our everyday lives, and because it's so relatable, because it brings up these issues, it can use comedy as a vessel to bring forth some of the issues taking place in society. We could see this in many sitcoms today, like The Good Place, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Blackish, and Modern Family, which are all about modern scenarios, modern parts of life, and somewhat sometimes a social criticism of these things, and social commentary about uh, things, parts of our everyday life that might not be so great. And this really started to happen in sitcoms during the 1970s. My girlfriend was actually a history major with me in graduate school, and she wrote her whole thesis about 1970s sitcoms and their commentary, their as sitcoms as a way of bringing forth these issues of gender and race in the 1970s. So I'm going to draw from some of that and talk about it because it's very interesting. And these sitcoms are getting put on TV. And remember, in the 1970s, there weren't that many channels, right? That these TVs only had a few channels. Not like the hundreds and thousands of channels that we have today, that there was only a select number of channels that people could watch, and families would gather and watch these TV shows. Um, Earlier, you guys had to watch a Leave It to Beaver episode, right? And those are the 1950s sitcoms that were less social commentary. They were more focused on everything's going great in America, right? This is um, American society at its fullest where everything's great. In the 1970s, we start to see a pushback of that, especially in sitcoms. One of the first sitcoms to do this was Norman Lear's show All in the Family. So All in the Family, a very popular show in the 1970s. It had the show's main character Archie Bunker. We could see him in that the bottom right corner of this picture over here. He was designed to mock reactionary middle-aged white men during the 1970s, and but audiences ended up embracing him because he was so relatable, right? He was just this old middle-aged guy, white guy who was looking back to the good old days, right? Um, and he represented this backward thinking that many middle-aged white men at the time had about the good old days in the 1950s after World War II, where everything was going great in America. And this is and it sort of show how he goes through life in the 1970s um, with his family. So this show is also important because it had a black family in it called the Jeffersons. And the Jeffersons were the first African American families to have a major role as neighbors in a television show with a white family. Now, African Americans have been represented in TV shows before in American history and on TV, but a lot of times these roles were more of like employee employer roles, right? Like African Americans as the servants or employees of the white main characters. But All in the Family was different because it showed a African American family who also had major roles within this show. So a big turning point about this of this. So another show that Norman Lear produced was a sitcom called Good Times about a black family and their lives in the early 70s. Now, these shows were very popular and they brought to light many of the societal issues taking place in America at this time. But the producers of these shows were criticized because by the public because most of the African Americans that were represented in these sitcoms were poor or were represented as generally lower class. So in response, Norman Lear he produced a spin-off show taking the Jefferson family from All in the Family and moving them into the city. And this show was called The Jeffersons, which was very popular in the 1970s. Um, all right, so I'm gonna play you like a little clip of it. Hopefully it doesn't get flagged or anything by YouTube. But just to show how how this show represented African Americans. So hold on a second. Okay. Well, we're moving on up to the east side, to a deluxe apartment in the sky. We're moving on up to the east side. We finally got a piece of the pie. All right, I'm gonna stop it there. Hopefully it doesn't get flagged. Um, so I encourage you to watch The Jeffersons. It's a great show. Um, here's a link to it too, so you can watch the full thing. So this show depicted a African American family who became financially successful. The main character, as we see here on the left, George Jefferson, he had a successful business and he was moving on up to the east side, right? In that little clip, we could see how George and his wife are in a taxi moving up to their new apartment in the richer side of the city. And how his wife was crying because you know they are moving up. You know they're going places. They're being successful. Um, now, uh, a big part of the show was that they were depicted as a the only black family living in a world of predominantly rich white families in the city. For example, George Jefferson and the Jeffersons, they were the only black family in their building besides from an interracial couple who lived above them in their building. And you could see them in the little squares on the bottom over here. And their names were like the Wills or something. And this is also important because it was the first show to show a interracial couple on TV. So these shows, All in the Family, Good Times, and The Jeffersons, were just a few of these sitcoms that were produced at the time that brought to light many of the issues of African Americans that they were facing in the 1970s and a growing desegregated America, and showed their challenges. Um, one of the main unconscious or unexpected, unspoken expectations of white Americans at this time after the Civil Rights Act in 1968 was that many people unconsciously expected that African Americans would just assimilate to white culture, that they would just drop their culture and become more white. Now, while African Americans wanted to keep their now African Americans, they just wanted to keep their culture, they wanted to keep their lives, but they just wanted to be treated with equality. That's all they wanted. They just wanted equality. But there were expectations put on them that they would assimilate to white culture. So assimilation and equality, and this was something that many African Americans had to struggle with their expectations, and this is one of the topics that are shown throughout the Jeffersons. So it's a great show. I encourage you to watch it if you can. Now another way that America desegregated after the Civil Rights Act was through music. Disco became this big desegregated activity that celebrated blacks and whites in the United States. And incorporated dancing and music from all over the country through religion and songs and things that how people would dance in some churches and stuff, and all brought to disco. I'm sure you've seen disco before, right? With the disco ball and the wide pants and the dancing, all that good stuff. So disco was actually one of these big popular activities that became desegregated in the 1970s that both black and whites actively together participated in. Now, a growing music genre at this time that was also getting popular was hip hop, which was created by inner city African Americans. So, hip hop is actually interesting because it was a kind of music created by African Americans um, throughout the country without getting whitewashed. So think back into the 1920s when we talked about the Roaring Twenties and jazz and all that stuff, where jazz was created by African Americans, but it was eventually whitewashed to be presented for white listeners. Also, rock and roll has its roots in African American music as well, but it was picked up by record labels, and we have people like Elvis who culturally appropriated many of these songs, and this became rock music, right? That's why we think of Elvis as the king of rock, even though rock music has its roots in African American music. But unlike jazz and rock and roll, African Americans created hip hop, and it became a very popular form of music that did not get whitewashed to the extent of jazz and rock. And that it really stuck within African American culture, but also it was celebrated by people of all races across the United States. Um, Hip hop was one of these very important music genres that eventually evolved into the rap of today. Um, so, uh, for example, the Sugar Hill Gang was a milestone in this because in their 1979 record "Rapper's Delight," it was the first rap single to reach Billboard's top 40 list. I'll play a minute of the song to see if you could hear so you could hear it and listen to it. It might be different than the rap or hip hop of today, but this is where it sort of gets its origins. Um, okay. Sorry. Hold on.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right.
And boogie say up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat. Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat.
Okay, that's enough of that song. It goes on for like 14 more minutes, so I won't play you the whole thing. All right, Rapper's Delight, Sugar Hill Gang, one of the most popular hip hop singles of the hip hop albums of the 1970s. Um, it goes on for another like 13 minutes, but you've heard this song before. I'm sure you have. So this music is different than what is popular today, but it is what modern rap's roots are. And at this time, it helped popularize African American music with mainstream popular culture, meaning white popular culture, as it was, without getting whitewashed. And because of this, many school dances throughout the 70s and 80s, you would have people break dance to this song, which it was a pretty funny sight. Um, all right, so also while this is happening in cinema, we see a great change too. We see a growth of westerns in Hollywood, but also popular cop dramas and things like that about law enforcement. We see very popular films like 1971's Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood, which captured a darker side of the national mood. But as many Americans watched these westerns and reminisced on the supposed good days of law and order in the United States, they viewed all the chaos that was taking place outside. There were uh, uh, while while at this time there were violent riots taking place across America as tensions from the civil rights movement started to boil over. These Americans just wanted civil rights. They and wanted to demonstrate that. But unlike the more peaceful marches of the early 1970s, these protests erupted into violent urban riots. Civil unrest broke out across the country, but in riots such as the Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965, the Newark riot in 1967, and Detroit in 1967. So these riots in major cities across the United States, and many of them at these urban riots were televised across the country, depicting the physical altercations between white police officers and African Americans. Um, Tens of thousands of Americans participated in these riots, and many looted and destroyed white-owned businesses. There were dozens of deaths and tens of millions of dollars of property damage. Uh, and one of the main parts of these protests was protest against urban poverty. Uh, while the political achievements of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 helped to guarantee legal, social, and political equality in America, it did not secure financial equality. This is a major problem in America that continues to exist to this day. It's a fact that, on average, African Americans, Hispanics, and other peoples of color in the United States are more likely to live in poverty and face economic inequality versus whites. Uh, so sadly, this is not due to a single issue that can be easily fixed. The economic problems that many people of color experienced in the 1970s are still seen today. In recent decades, we have seen a general increase of economic standard of living amongst millions of Americans, but there's still many financial problems that Americans continue facing today. For example, the redlining of cities in America based on race that took place starting with the New Deal continued to divide urban areas across the country based off of income and race. And this has led uh, to cities being divided amongst race and amongst income levels. And this affects our modern world because schools are funded by the government based off of the incomes that of those areas generally in most cases. And because of this, many of these low income areas of predominantly people of color, they have less funding for their schools. Um, Also, this is happening in Atlanta where gentrification, the development of stores, expensive housing, and apartments in the cities are pushing people out of lower income who can no longer afford to live in those areas anymore, right? Because a Costco got built there, because a Whole Foods is there, or a new fancy apartment complex that there's no way these families could afford. Um, and gentrification has taken place all across our country, and it has its roots in the 1970s in what's happening at this time. So though legally politically African Americans were secured some freedoms, there were still many economic problems that these laws failed to address in the 1960s, and they continue to address today. And I like to think that things are slowly getting better, but the way these things improve are by talking about it, right? By learning about this and acknowledging that these things exist. And like I said, in the 70s, tensions were rising about problems, and many of these problems continue to shine through the cracks and exist today. So anyway, thank you for your attention in part 2 of this video. I'm going to conclude I'm going to continue this lecture in part 3, where we're going to talk about Richard Nixon and his presidency. So I encourage you to watch that one as well. All right. Thank you.